برای توی کوچه رقصیدن، برای ترسیدن به وقت بوسیدن، برای خواهرم، خواهرت، خواهرامون، برای تغییر مغزها که پوسیدن.
All right, Kian, Meshkat, welcome to our podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you here. You are a sanctions attorney, an export controls expert. I really wanted to hear from you during these recent events in Iran as to what do the new sanctions mean, and how can obviously Iranian Americans make sure they don't run afoul of these sanctions, and ultimately how can they help while in compliance with the sanctions. So tell us how it all started. What was the first sanction that precipitated right after Mahsa Amini's death?
Sure. Well, first, thanks for having me. Always a pleasure to talk to you, especially on this podcast. It all starts. Mahsa Amini is killed at the hands of the morality police mid-September, and then we start getting protests happening all over Iran. It's getting shared all over social media. Video clips, horrific photos of the government crackdowns that are happening. And so the question becomes, people start saying, why isn't the US doing anything? And the US actually starts to quickly move in with sanctions actions. And, Iran already has, or the US has tons of economic sanctions on the Iranian government and Iran as a whole, and a lot of key players in Iran and in Iranian industry. So what the US government starts doing through the US Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC for short, as a lot of people have heard, which administers US economic sanctions, they start designating certain organizations in Iran, and they start designating key government officials. So since the protest started, there's been about three sanctions actions that have taken place as far as sanctioning people. The first one was with the morality police. You have the US government sanctioning the morality police and the executive order. There's been several. So the way sanctions work is there's a ton of legal authorities underlying them. And the key one that OFAC's been using is Executive Order 13553. And that one is specific to addressing human rights abuses in Iran, either by Iranian agencies or instrumentalities, ministries, and Iranian officials.
And I'm sorry, and when you say underlying authority, that means the administration has legislative authority to impose these sanctions based on pre-existing laws. They have the ability to
yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So a lot of times when something goes on in Iran or another sanctioned jurisdiction or a country that the US wants to go after with sanctions, you'll see legislation passed at that time, or the president will issue an executive order.
Right.
In this instance, a lot of these authorities, well, actually all the authorities were already in existence.
Sure.
And they're just resorting to those.
Right.
Especially this executive order 13553 that I mentioned, which is quite old. I think it's maybe almost a decade old.
Yeah.
And it's always been used to go after human rights abuses by Iranian actors.
Mm-hmm.
So we get the morality police sanctioned, some other key players that...
On the morality police, if I may just ask, I have two questions just as someone that wants to learn. How does the U.S. identify what is the is it one person, is it an institution?
Right.
Obviously, it's an Iranian-based entity,
right,
which the U.S. can't get to. But how do they point those sanctions, I guess, so it does damage? I want to know what damage do they hope to do to the morality police, which clearly don't care about their own people. But I'm just wondering, how do they get to them?
Yeah. So I think there's two parts to your question. Like, how does the U.S. government first identify who to sanction?
Right.
And then what do those sanctions entail? Like, what's the impact of it?
Right. Right.
At least on paper.
Right.
So the morality police, quote unquote.
Right.
My Farsi is not great, so I don't know what the actual name in Farsi is.
Yeah.
But it's supposed to be a specific component of what's called Iran's law enforcement forces, at least how the US government identifies it. And
Okay.
look, OFAC is in consultation whenever it makes one of these decisions with other agencies. So like the Department of State, Department of Commerce, Attorney General, depending on what the, again, underlying legal authority is that instructs them to do so. So this law enforcement forces of Iran, LEF, the morality police is a component of that. LEF itself has been sanctioned for like almost 10 years for the crackdown that they did on the protests a decade ago when, the 2009 protests that happened. And for whatever reason, now they've decided they really need to go after the morality police. Maybe it's a PR stunt, but maybe there's something I don't know. And by sanctioning the morality police, what happens under this order is any property they have under US, the control or possession of a US person becomes blocked. Okay. Now, what does that mean? That means that, whatever funds or assets the morality police holds anywhere in the world, if it's in the possession or control of a US person, they're supposed to block it or freeze it and report it to OFAC. So because hands off. Now, right. The question becomes, do you think the morality police has assets outside of Iran? Yeah. I think it's unlikely, but again, maybe there's something we don't know.
Right.
Another impact of the sanctions, because everything becomes blocked or supposed to be blocked, that's within the possession or control of US persons. No US person can engage in any transactions or dealings right. with that sanctioned person. Here, the morality police again. So, and to add to that, nobody anywhere in the world can cause a US person to engage in any of those transactions. So what happens a lot of times with sanctions is somebody gets sanctioned and they can no longer transfer funds or engage in cross-border payments or business because nobody wants to touch them in case there's a US nexus involved. And if there's a US dollar transaction, there's always a US nexus because it has to go through a US bank.
Right.
Most business globally is done with the dollar. And that's where sanctions really get their bite.
Okay.
But here, I don't see the morality police, sending a wire transfer overseas.
Right. Not publicly, not your Bank of America typical bank wire. They find ways to hide it. But before we move on from morality police, is there a list of names? Is it like 500 names or 5 managers or directors? No, it's just an entity.
It's just morality police. So let's say none of their officials, let me take a step back. I think they only designated the head of Iran's morality police, specifically a guy named Mohammad Rostami Cheshmegachi, long name.
Right.
I believe they only sanctioned him specifically, but it's up to whoever's doing business with someone in Iran to ultimately do their homework, do their due diligence, and make sure that they're not doing something with the morality police. So if you're doing business with Iran, who's this guy who wants to send you money? Is he an official of the morality police? If he is doing so on behalf of the morality police?
Right. There most people will none of those known names will ever sign a wire transfer. There'll be some underling or something. But one last one. I think people are really interested in outing these people, and that's happening organically on social media. I see their national card and pictures and names and all kinds of things appearing on social media of the oppressors, the coercive organs of the state, the individuals that are doing these things. Is there a way, I'm just curious, is there a way for an American citizen or someone to send a list or recommend to OFAC, hey, these people work for, tell OFAC, these people are direct employees of the morality police, you should add them to your sanctions list. Is that even possible?
Look, I mean, I'm all for public advocacy. You know, you can go and summon your congressman or whoever, or write to OFAC if you want, or the State Department, and tell them your thoughts. There is no formal process in place for that.
Okay.
I mean, I've had people reach out to me before saying, "Hey, I wanna rat this guy out. He's been doing stuff that's
Illegal or
say
against
illegal or
sanctions.
sanctionable or evading sanctions." And there really is no like whistleblower program.
Okay.
But there is, at least with other programs, other sanctions programs, not specific to Iran, there's organizations or NGOs that they have people like from OFAC who
I
work
see.
there now.
Okay.
And what they do is they create these like targeting packets.
There you go. Okay.
And they put together these packets on like specific persons, explaining why, what they've done, why it's sanctionable under a certain authority.
Right.
And then they send that in.
I see.
But they have their contacts there,
Right.
in the US government.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to understand, give our audience a practical to-do list, if possible, because people may not understand how sanctions work, and if they really hurt a corrupt regime that can do anything it wants, they're certainly not worried about the law or the U.S. law, at least of all. But if there are NGOs that Iranians can work with to and Iranians would have the best intel than anybody else as to who their oppressors are. I just wanted to provide a channel for that conversation, whatever the channel is, and I hope it's effective. That's all.
Yeah. I mean, there's NGOs out there, but I think their mission is to focus on other regions. Maybe this is an idea for somebody out there to start something.
There we go.
Like that if they want to.
Okay. Go ahead. Go ahead then. So morality police sanctions, and then
several government officials, high up government officials. So you have like the head of the morality police, you have Minister of Intelligence, you have the deputy commander of the Basij, you have the commander of the Iranian Army's special forces,
right?
Minister of Communication. A lot of the people who were involved in crackdowns on the internet,
right?
So OFAC has been targeting a lot of these, and several prison wardens. Evin prison was itself sanctioned during Donald Trump's time, and now they've sanctioned the warden of the prison. Now, again, it comes back to the same logic of designating the morality police. I don't think Evin prison sits there and engages in cross-border commerce.
Right.
There's probably someone else getting them the stuff they need. So I would hope that OFAC is taking that into consideration as well.
Right.
But these government officials, many of them have already been sanctioned.
Right.
There's, for Russian oligarchs, at least, they say that amongst them, if they're not sanctioned, it's not a good look.
Right.
So you want to be part of the club.
Right.
So, I don't know what type of actual bite these sanctions will have. One thing they do, because under this specific order, this executive order 13553, it in part implements a very important statute. The long name is Comprehensive Iran Sanctions Accountability and Divestment Act, short name CISADA. Mm-hmm. And what CISADA does, it authorizes the State Department to impose visa bans on anyone that's sanctioned under or for these reasons under that executive order that I mentioned, including, I believe, and don't quote me on this, their family members.
I see.
And that's something I've been seeing a lot of people talk about, is sanctioning the family members, a lot of them who come to the US, and imposing visa bans on them.
Right.
So maybe this will
has
have
a bite.
That impact.
So we got 5 more minutes left. So is there a way that the U.S. can freeze the assets of these people and their families?
Well, by virtue of being sanctioned under this order, the assets are technically frozen. But it's the U.S. government having private industry doing the policing for them. So like if a bank has their account, they expect the bank to block it and report it.
Right.
Now, if you're asking me if there's some sort of authority to seize them and forfeit them, perhaps to the government, to the U.S. government or something else, that depends on if there's like certain crimes going on. And that gets a little bit out of my wheelhouse.
Right.
Yeah.
But in general, though, you're right. Most banks have a compliance officer or a whole department.
Oh, a whole division.
A division of compliance. And their job is to obviously look at the federal law and the sanctions to make sure none of their customers are on that list. So what's next? There were other things that have really happened since September 22nd that you mentioned in the next 2-3 minutes that we want to get to.
Yeah, so we're jumping to those real quick.
Right.
Shortly after the protests happened, government starts cracking down on the internet and reportedly shutting it down all over. It keeps going in and out. So since 2013, U.S. government has had this general license in place, which means any U.S. person can go ahead and use it subject to those terms. It's called GLD, General License D. And on September, I believe, 23rd, they published General License, the second version of it, D2. And what D2 does is it really expands on the authorizations for providing certain internet-related software and services that are imperative to ensuring internet access for the Iranian people, and enabling tech companies outside of Iran, which I guess under the last rendition of the license were kind of confused as to what their obligations were in order to comply, really clearing things up for them, like especially when it comes to cloud services. A lot of these platforms, these softwares, like the anti-censorship tools, the VPN tools, they require cloud service support. And this authorization provides that. Another thing, Elon Musk was tweeting that he's going to be providing Starlink service to Iran. And we're seeing them on the ground right now. We're seeing those terminals being shared on social media, making their way into Iran. So when General License D2 came out on September 23rd, and the Secretary of State tweeted about it, Musk said that it's being activated. And I think a lot of people got confused thinking that this general license authorizes the provision of Starlink. The Treasury official that day, when speaking to reporters, he specifically said, GLD2 doesn't actually authorize it. But if they write in, I'm sure it's something we're going to look into. So maybe, because I'm assuming Starlink or SpaceX has received the necessary authorization to do that. Iranians have been talking about providing, Iranians here, in the diaspora, whether in the US or abroad, have talked about sending in those antennas or terminals that you need to access Starlink in Iran. But I'd be careful doing that, especially if you are a US person here in the US, because you'd want to make sure that you're following the general license. And I'm not entirely clear if those terminals qualify, but they've been making their way in.
Yeah. No, this is amazing. Thank you so much, Kian. I think this is all the time we have for this segment, but there is a ton of more things to talk about. This issue with Iran is live, it's happening. People are living and dying on the streets as we speak, and they are in desperate need of whatever help we can provide legally from the outside. And it sounds like the U.S. government can do a little bit more, direct sanctions, a little bit more freezing of the assets. Seems like there's a role for NGOs to play for some investigation to bite the sanctioned parties a little bit more directly than a Washington D.C. executive order, which I don't think the manager or whatever the governors of the Evin prison or elsewhere are going to notice today, especially since they're used to hiding their money. So there's a little bit more to do, and so that means a little bit more conversation. We're going to talk more, Kian Meshkat. Thank you so much for your time, for what
Thanks
you're
for having
doing, and the information you're providing to our community. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.